I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
Relativists need to start living in the real world.
I'll be in the Chamber of Understanding.
After watching some of my videos, relativist wackos on YouTube have taken it upon themselves to educate me about reality, as though they have anything more than conjecture to offer.
All right, relativism. Reading the information section on this video, relativists never learn that lack of evidence doesn't make something valid. Then again, relativists haven't moved on very much for thousands of years. Warning, I will block users and remove comments that revert to the same old relativist tactics that provide no proof of an argument. The first proof he provides is his own blog. Pyro's video, which is a very good video. All right. Interesting link addressing the fallacies of relativism. This is from Stanford EDU's page on Plato. All right, let's load this up. Relativism from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Relativism is not a single doctrine, but a family of views whose common theme is that some central aspect of experience, thought, evaluation, or even reality is somehow relative to something else. Relativism is not a single doctrine. According to the source that you have cited as interesting information regarding relativism, it's not a single doctrine. Relativistic arguments often begin with plausible, even truistic premises. Example, that we are culturally and historically situated creatures, that justification cannot go on forever, and that we cannot talk without using language or think without using concepts, only to end up with implausible, even inconsistent conclusions. There is little consensus, however, about how to block the slide from inviting points of departure to uninviting destinations. Both sides in debates over relativism tend to oversimplify the views of the other side. Does that sound familiar? The problem is exacerbated by the fact that relativistic theses often come in two forms: a bold and arresting version, which is proclaimed, and a weaker, less vulnerable version, which is defended. With the first having the tendency to morph into the second when under attack. So the problem with relativistic theses here is that they tend to change as they are attacked. In other words, you end up with absurd conclusions by arguing against relativistic premises, but they lead to absurd conclusions if left alone. Relativism often sounds better in the abstract than it does when we get down to actual cases, which often turn out to be rather trivial. On the other hand, or quite implausible on the other. But it is also true that most academic philosophers in the English-speaking world see the label relativist as the kiss of death, so few have been willing to defend any version of the doctrine. Indeed, many explicit characterizations of relativism are to be found in the writings of unsympathetic opponents who sketch flimsy versions to provide easy targets for criticism. Now, does that sound familiar? Throwing around the word relativist as a label, using it as a broad category, which it is not, according to the link that you provided, as a way of essentially straw-manning your opponent, presenting a flimsy version of what they've said instead of the actual strong version of what they've said. Again, this is how what you are doing is characterized by the source you have provided. So, interesting thing about providing links and evidence, they have to actually support the argument that you're making. How's that for being objective?
One example is a YouTuber named Pyro314, a guy who, quite frankly, has the demeanor of an LSD reject from the 60s.
Pyro was perfectly polite in his video. What is the demeanor that you're talking about?
I'll leave a link to his video below, though I warn anyone that has any respect for scientific truth that this...
All right, scientific truth. What science? What is your area of discipline? Because I'm not seeing any peer-reviewed papers being brought up in your list of links. Starting from the bottom, we have sciencenews.org, wisegeek.com, wikipedia.org, nutters.org, stanford.edu, wikipedia.org, oregonstate.edu, stanford.edu, but these are like course primers. And then RockingMrE, blogspot.com. None of this is actual peer-reviewed paper. None of this comes from any discipline. What science do you actually participate in? Now, Pyro explained very well the applications of relativism to emerging theory in science. How can you explain gravitational lensing, the relationship between velocity and time, the relationship between space and time, large-scale GPS and the need to count on the curvature of space-time in order to make the damn thing work? How do you account for these other than relativity? Or do you not use the term relativism and relativity to work together? Because Pyro explained it really well, and you are not addressing anything that he said, which seems odd for someone who claims to have a firm grasp and respect for science. How do you solve quantum superstates if the perception or the act of observation is irrelevant to the objective truth of the matter? Because in the quantum scale, the superstate is incredibly important. This kind of relativism is what we are basing electronics on. Just as on the large scale, we are basing everything that we are concluding about the origin and evolution of the universe, the position of stars, the composition of other planets, all come from relativity. So what science is it? Now you're going to bring up later linguistics, sociolinguistics, and just brush it all aside. But the observation paradox, the observer paradox, is strongly a part of the science of linguistics, of sociobiology, of anthropology. Understanding that when you observe people, the act of observation changes their behavior. We see this with animals. The conditions under which you observe them affect their behavior. But what is objective about behavior? It is in response to environment. And if you don't understand that, then we have to rule out your competency in any social sciences. Unless the idea here is that when you say science, just like when you say objectivity, you don't define your terms whatsoever. You believe that social organisms can't be studied scientifically, because doing so relies on some degree of relativity. What is this science that you're talking about? What epistemic model are you employing? What discipline do you work in? What papers, what peer-reviewed scientific papers are you providing as evidence? Because what you've provided here, after your snarky little attempt at explaining what evidence is, why we need evidence, you've provided none. And more to the point, you don't provide evidence for the actual substantive points that you're making. it's more like you're pulling up class notes and presenting those as evidence for your point. It's absurd.
So I will have you screaming logical fallacy at your monitor.
What does logical fallacy have to do with science? You understand that the conclusions that we reach through mathematical modeling and observations of phenomena under disparate conditions is often counterintuitive. What does logic have to do with tidal forces? What does logic have to do with with electron clouds? What does logic have to do with engineering? It doesn't matter if it's illogical. It doesn't matter if it's irrational. It matters if it is supported by empirical evidence, falsifiable testing. But logical fallacy, I thought we were talking about science.
What's particularly annoying about relativists is that they act as though they're arbiters of inner gnosis.
What the fuck are you talking about? If you want to talk about objective exterior phenomena, link some fucking papers. Arbiters of inner gnosis? What is this? Is this a dime word way of saying everybody believes that they have an opinion? You want to rule opinion out of the debate without using the word opinion?
All the more irritating is that they seem to think their philosophical views are new, while science is somehow out of date. In actual...
That is absolutely an absurd thing to say. I guess this is the reason you're making this video. Like, this is the actual thrust of your argument, is to say relativism is nothing new. As if that somehow proves anything or is a relevant argument to make under any conditions whatsoever.
In fact, it's the scientific method that's the most cutting-edge field of discovery, while...
What does that mean? We are only now discovering the scientific method? Is that what that means? The scientific method is nothing new. The scientific method has been refined by philosophers, I guess they called themselves natural philosophers or philosophers of different degrees throughout the years. The scientific method is not cutting edge, it's not being redefined. What are you talking about?
For thousands of years, relativism has repeatedly attempted to diminish absolute truth with the same old arguments that rely on argumentum ad ignorantium, the attempt to claim something is true simply because it hasn't been proven to be false.
That's relativism? That something is true because it hasn't been proven to be false. What is that relative to? Let's go back to Stanford's definition. Relativism is not a single doctrine, but a family of views whose common theme is that some central aspect of experience, thought, evaluation, or even reality is somehow relative to something else. No, the idea that something is true because it hasn't been proven to be false is an objective constant. God of the gaps fallacy. It's people who claim to have an objective truth that can't be proven that occupy the niche that you are setting up for relativists. This has nothing to do with relativism as defined by your source, such as it is.
Relativism does have a use if we understand that perspective can influence concepts.
Not concepts. Concepts come from perspective, but concepts are also abstract. You can't view a concept. How is it that we are holding concepts towards real actors? That would be relativism. But concepts in and of themselves are nothing but a framework.
However, this by no means suggests that it's impossible to objectively understand the world around us. Instead, it tells us that we have to transcend to a level of understanding to fully realize absolute truth.
Transcend. Now, here's something that I wish that you had linked, or that you would explain what it is you mean by transcend. If we are only working in objective reality, then how is it that we transcend objective reality to understand objective reality? We have to be relative to objective reality in order to transcend it. Otherwise, the words that you're using have no meaning.
Stupid! You're so stupid!
In particular, we can do this by making empirical observations.
Empirical observations. That's observing what's there. We have to be relative to what we observe. Otherwise, we are what we observe, and there's nothing to observe.
Which time and again have allowed us to make unprecedented breakthroughs in our understanding of the natural world.
Any discovery would be an unprecedented breakthrough. Get to the point.
Sadly, relativists regularly try to attack science by claiming that this is largely or even completely impossible to achieve. A perfect example of this are the science wars that sparked up in the 90s, when postmodernists took it upon themselves to fallaciously claim that science is unreliable. And surprisingly, the arguments put forward could not be verified by any evidence, instead relying on the same old points that relativists have always reverted to.
I'm not going to get on that. I mean, that's fine. But you're still continuing to abuse the term relativism as defined by your source.
At the SoCal affair, which I addressed in my video, Postmodernist Nonsense, this crowd were left with egg on their face, fully exposing the fact that postmodernism is nothing more than wordplay designed to deconstruct one's impression of reality.
This video is nothing but wordplay, considering that you haven't provided any sources or references of any substance, anything peer-reviewed, nothing. And there will be nothing by the end of this video. It's just wordplay. You are already abusing the words that you are using. Relativism and transcend is the two biggest examples. If this is what your argument relies on, then it is nothing but what you are claiming your falsely defined opponents to be doing.
That is why you fail.
This is nothing new, despite the fact that postmodernists would like you to believe they're some sort of hip group of cultural pioneers leading the way in human progress.
You mean by doing really cheap things like playing the guitar at the introduction of their videos to show you how hip and cool they are?
The first major relativist philosophers were the sophists of ancient Greece, and it was Protagoras who stated that man is the measure of all things. This sounds familiar given that all relativists that superseded Protagoras, including the likes of Immanuel Kant, Friedrich Nietzsche, and of course the postmodernists, have...
So that would be people like Einstein, who superseded Newton. That would be people like Schrödinger.
Argued that absolute truth is impossible due to the limits of human perception. Plato
Humans not have limited perception?
countered the views of Protagoras by using his concept of the divided line.
Oh my God, who the hell cares?
Plato places relative knowledge at the bottom of the line, while the top of the line is occupied by objective truths.
He called them the forms, and they were transcendental. But they don't fit into the epistemology of modern science. Plato argued that anything, any object, the objective material thing that you interact with is only a shadow cast by some universal truth. I see a chair, but where is chairness? I see the clouds, but what is cloudness? And it's an idea that, while philosophically challenging, is it's why it was subject of ridicule by playwrights in the time. See Aristophanes' The Clouds. But the forms aren't real. I should say they're God. They are non-existent but substantial. Plato believed that knowledge comes from remembering universal truths, and as such there really isn't such a thing as discovery. Now, does that sound like the foundation of modern science?
Plato felt that if we strive to understand reality, we can elevate our understanding.
But that's not what science is. Science isn't elevating our understanding by striving to understand reality. Science is painstaking observation of the material world. Now, this is actually a critically important distinction because Plato, his philosophy was completely rejected by his student Aristotle. And it is Aristotle's statements on objective truth, perhaps I should say material truth, that Randian objectivism is based on. The concept that a thing is. Your understanding of a thing is limited, but you gaining more understanding about a thing informs you. It doesn't inform the thing. The isness of a thing is not affected by your understanding of it. That's why inquiry is so important. But there are no universal abstract truths, ideals to which we will ascend. That's the fundamental difference between the two philosophies, and they are diametrically opposed.
By modern standards, this method is however limited, given that it paints the world as a dualistic realm.
This, by modern standards, this idea is completely rejected by scientific observation because it offers us nothing. Now, this is not to say that the idea doesn't exist in other areas, philosophy, mysticism, spirituality. I mean, these concepts are still a part of human endeavor and the human search for truth. They just don't have anything to do with science, because you can't discover new things. You can't even come up with the interesting questions to put you in the position to know where to look to discover new things. This has nothing to do with modern thought.
As opposed to the multi-layered universe empirically proven to be true. By the time
Multi-layered universe or multi-causal universe or multiverse, empirically demonstrated to be true, but there's gaps, there's holes in our understanding. We use terms like dark matter, dark energy to describe what those gaps are, but we have competing models, we have dueling models, we have the problem of black holes. How is information conserved as it goes into the black hole? Do we have this problem of observation that from the universe's point of view you are destroyed going into a black hole, but from your point of view nothing happens. You just emerge into a universe identical to your own, but in which you did not exist before. So to the universe quite a lot has changed, but to you it's just another day. You just passed through event horizon. That's modern science.
When we entered the 18th century, it became alarming for many how science was able to make breakthroughs in our understanding at a pace that far outweighed anything that came before it. To many, this was an exciting period of discovery, while for others, this threatened the very fabric of what they believed. Religious philosophers such as Immanuel Kant were principally interested in defining a concept of God during a time when science was making it increasingly irrational to believe such a being could exist.
Well, that's not really a correct timeline. Transcendental philosophers in America throughout the 18th century were already rejecting the concept of God as intellectual entity and looking for something more entrenched in nature, but that wasn't a scientific discourse, that was a spiritual discourse. But Descartes already addressed all of these issues that was kind of a done deal before Kant came around. But it's interesting that you would trash Kant and up Plato, because Kant had the noumena phenomena distinction, which is very important following Aristotelian logic to get us up to Randian objectivism, that the isness of a thing, the being by itself of anything is not defined by your observation of it. That was Kant's argument, that there is always going to be a separation between what you experience of your observation and the experience of being of what you are observing. For example, what does this smell like? Well, you don't know. We don't have a technology that transmits smell, and why would we? We don't communicate with it. What something sounds like, can you tell what the material of something is based on its sound? Well, to an extent, you can tell if something is cloth, if it's wood, if it's metal, wood on metal, metal on metal, but what metal? What cloth? What kind of plastic? Sound just doesn't carry that much information to us. Smell doesn't carry that much information to us as it does for other creatures that have other primary senses, or senses that we do not have and could not really comprehend unless we observed through other methods what they can do with them. We don't communicate through smell. But that doesn't mean that there aren't smells all around us, just as there's light we can't perceive, sound we can't perceive. And this is an important thing to understand for modern science. You have to be able you have to be prepared to accept the reality of things that you can't observe and may not even be able to interact with, but can only model.
Once again, it was perspective that Kant relied upon as the basis of his philosophy.
Perspective is the only thing that we can rely upon. That's what empirical evidence is. The empirical method is utilizing your perspective. How do you observe something without having a perspective? You need to understand that when you're looking at something, what you see is only that angle. You have to look at it from multiple angles. That's empiricism. If you don't understand perception, if you don't understand perspective, and you don't understand the limitations of the equipment that you bring to the question, then you cannot achieve anything even resembling anything that even deserves an approximation of the word objective.
With arguments typically derived from the suggestion that we can never truly understand the experiences of others. In the critique of...
Can we? Can we objectively understand the experiences of others? Experiences of others can only be communicated to us. We don't experience them. We don't even have a firm grasp on our own experiences because our memory plays tricks on us. That's something that's been empirically demonstrated through the science of psychology. That's not something we can figure out for ourselves. We need other observers to act on us, to report to us on our consistency or inconsistency. As individual actors, we really can't be sure of anything. We can't even be sure of our own independent reality. See conditions such as schizophrenia.
Pure reason, Kant claims that a priori knowledge is held independently of experience. And so,
in other words, you can't rely on pure reason. You have to have experience of some kind in order to relate to the world around you. That sounds perfectly valid to me.
So is also independent of empirical knowledge, and he uses this as the basis of justifying the human soul and the existence of God.
Now, I don't believe in either of those things, but we do have instinct, do we not? We have autonomic nerves and functions, we have muscle memory, we have conditioning that is not part of our conscious mind. Yeah. There's part of who we are, very important to who we are, that is not part of our actual thinking and is not related to empirical data or the empirical method.
Yet again, none of this is new, and all of these esoteric questions are logical fallacies based on argumentum ad ignorantium.
No. They are understandings of the very real limitations in human perception. Aristotle would say, and I would agree, there is an objective there. There is a thing. The universe is an entity. But we cannot conflate our understanding of anything that occurs within the universe with the universe. There is always going to be a limitation between the pure reason that exists in our mind and the method of understanding of the universe around us, because it's just not part of us.
These ideas can be traced back to the problem of other minds, which has bogged down philosophers for millennia.
Well, there's several solutions to the problem of other minds, but I mean, how you address that is really a matter of, I mean, it's very instructive of what your philosophy is, how your mind works, but I mean, this is kind of relative. How you solve the problem is really up to you.
It goes like this. Since I can only know what I am thinking, how can I know that others have minds? A key area of philosophy that deals with this nebulous problem is solipsism. But before relativists such as existentialists and postmodernists try to distance themselves from this label, they should be aware that a form of solipsism exists that is uncannily similar to the typical argumentation used by those who wish to deny objective reality.
Well, here's the thing. I'll go back to this first source you cited because it's one I've read. I'll come back to this again. Relativism is not a single doctrine, but a family of views. You're using this as a label. So you bring up solipsism as a label. That there is empirical or existential solipsism, that's a term used for a philosophy, really doesn't mean anything. If you're trying to conflate that with the fact that solipsism carries a negative connotation. But what's really most important here is that you haven't provided your answer to the problem. Why bring up the problem of other minds if you haven't solved it? How do you know that other people have minds? What is your solution? As I said, it doesn't really change anything, but it's awfully instructive, isn't it? But why bring it up if you don't present a solution? What is your objective solution that blows away all other solutions? The slam dunk case that will change philosophy. What is the objective solution?
Namely, epistemological solipsism. This philosophy postulates that only the perspective of the observer can ever truly be known. Doesn't that sound familiar?
Well, it doesn't mean that other perspectives don't exist. I mean, do you know what my perspective is? We have to communicate. We have to have a dialogue, which, by the way, we won't. Because I'm blocked from his channel, and RockingMrE blocks people and deletes their comments, so no, there's not going to be a dialogue. But that's what's required for you to understand my perspective. You will never, ever, ever actually know anyone's perspective but your own, unless you're willing to narrate for other people, but that is solipsism. And that's the problem with your use of labels as a way of telling people who they really are. It is solipsistic. You tell other people what they are, what their perspective is, instead of shutting the fuck up for 15 minutes and listening. That deserves the label solipsistic.
Why, yes, it does, given that all relativists have used this exact premise to defend their views.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
All relativists. Back to abusing the definition of relativism as provided by your source.
While also attempting to dismiss objective truth.
Which you still haven't defined.
Spend all day forming counter-arguments for the rubbish that relativists concoct.
Yeah, you could spend all day doing it, but are they all going to be as vacuous, vapid, and based on personal preferences the ones you've used so far?
But they're all largely taken from the argument of perspective. This, of course, is hugely...
Yeah, except for when they're not. Relativism is acknowledging that some things exist only relative to others. A simple example here would be a rainbow. I mean, I feel like this example has been done to death. Actually, I think someone else used it in a response to you, but rainbows don't exist unless you are standing at the correct angle to observe the phenomena. So what is objective about the existence of a rainbow? Similarly, are you saying that things don't change based on the perspective from which you observe them? That you have to observe something from multiple perspectives to have any idea what's actually there?
Exaggerated, given that there are countless examples of independently formulated objective truths that make up human understanding.
But you still haven't defined what an objective truth is. Give me an example. Are we talking about quantifiable truths? Are we talking about qualitative truths? Are we talking about truths that relate to sociology? Are we talking about truths that relate to linguistics? I mean, try this. If you want to say that, for example, sounds are objectively true, try learning a foreign language. Try distinguishing in everyday conversation between the sounds h and h, because they're separate letters to Arabs, or the sounds and ah, because those are separate letters. Similarly, sit down with an Asian speaker like a Korean or someone who speaks Japanese and try to understand why they can't tell the difference between R and L, or S and sh. I mean, these are objectively different, are they not? If R and L weren't objectively different, then the English language wouldn't function. Well, why is it there are people who cannot tell the difference? And put yourself on both sides. Learn a language that has a different phonetic structure from your own, and then try to teach someone your language. They come from a language that has a phonetic structure different from their own, and then say everything is objective truth. Okay, there's objective truths. Not that you've defined them, but there's subjective truths, there's relative truths as well, and they're documented. And where does this lead you? Argument from popularity? I mean, what's the point you're trying to make?
Take mathematics. Archimedes developed calculus over 2,000 years before Newton and Leibniz formed their own methods in the 18th century. This was only realized in 1998 when the owners of a strange book took it to an auction house, only to later discover that it previously belonged to Archimedes and was lost for all this time. Therefore, there are two completely independent moments in time when calculus was defined.
Well, not to mention that Newton and Leibniz invented their calculus independently from each other, and so they have different ways of denoting formulas. But also, not to mention that other people have invented mathematical formulas after they've been invented. They just because these are observable truths. These are based on observations of how things are related. But mathematics is a really terrible support of your position, because mathematics is all about relationships. What good is 1? What good is 5? 5 what?
I'm not sure. I'm afraid we need to use math.
5 bags of money, $5. Those are both the number 5. But 5 bags of money, $5, 5 bars of gold are worth very different objective amounts. So what good are the conceptual objectives of mathematics compared to the real world? Mathematics is nothing but relative. What is the relationship between the numbers and the quantities that they represent? Are you using data sets? Are you using asymptotes? Are you modeling something like motion? Is this in 3 dimensions? Are they vectors? Do you have to calculate sines, cosines? Are you operating tangents? Are you forming parabolas? Numbers by themselves are worthless. They have to be related to something to have value.
Which would be impossible if calculus were relative. Relativists also claim that language and literacy are drawn from perspective.
Okay, not quite done with the mathematics thing. Engineering is the greatest practical application of mathematics because we can actually solve problems with it, problems that we couldn't solve otherwise. You know, it's like an objective truth, the bridge stands or collapses. It's an objective truth whether or not you can use the road. But it's only objective relative to your use. Can I use a road? Can I use a bridge? Can I live in this house? But whether it's a road, whether it's a bridge, whether it's a house, is that objectively true? Is it objectively not a house if you can't live in it? Well, the structure's the same. So it being a house is relative to your ability to live in it. Just as a chair isn't objectively a chair because I can sit on it. I can sit on all kinds of things. A bed isn't objectively a bed because I can lay on it. I can lay on all kinds of things. But in engineering, talk to any engineer and ask them to design you an objective structure. They will ask you, what do you want out of it? What are your design parameters? And those are relative. Those are defined by desire. Now, yeah, you say there's a use for them, and that's what defines your parameters, but that's just the thing. Relative to what you intend to use something for, from an engineering perspective, defines whether it is objectively good enough or not. All right, move on to the language thing.
And since this is the basis of communicating the scientific method, this makes it flawed.
This is not the basis for communicating the scientific method. Scientific method is empirical. It's communicated by language. It is the results of observation that are communicated through math. Results, not the scientific method. Results of experiments, correlating data, collating data. And this is why we can look at things like anthropology and sociology, economics, and consider them scientific, because there is data involved. You can apply the scientific method to things that are not formal scientific disciplines. It's just a method. It's not communicated by math. Math is for understanding your results.
Again, literacy and language have both occurred at completely independent times and places.
Well, in the sense that there are different languages that have different forms and structures, different alphabets and so forth, but there are certain linguistic truths that are always the same because language is related to brain structures, and this is very simple. You have brain structures that we have, you have language. You lack those brain structures, you don't have language. And there's a lot of research to be done on communication among animals, but language is unique to humans. And you would have to redefine the term language to apply it to anything else. As far as we can tell, the point at which we became modern humans, we had the capacity for language, and we diverged afterwards, provided that at one point there was a single human population. Stands to reason there was only one language. All the other languages diverged from that. Now, here's what I said before. If you're going to make this assertion, this is where you need evidence here. This is what you would need to back up with evidence, this claim, which is where you would be looking for some kind of peer-reviewed data, some kind of scientific paper. This claim that language evolved among separate populations and didn't descend from one and then vary over time. For crying out loud.
It would be impossible for distinct human descriptions of reality through literature and language to be so remarkably similar if perspective made these things relative.
Well, you understand that in physical evolution, things can crop up separately and end up looking almost exactly the same and having the same form and function. Wildwood Claire pointed this out in one of her videos to a creationist about marsupials and mammals, wolves and Tasmanian tigers, I believe. They're not related. One is a placental mammal, the other is a marsupial, and yet morphologically they are identical in terms of what ecological niche they're designed, or they evolved into, and that's the key point here. In nature, things do mirror each other. They do crop up parallel to each other without interacting with each other, because they are the result of adapting to the conditions around them. So even if the scenario you were outlining was true, which I do not believe it to be, as I've explained, it would still be feasible given natural processes. We're all reacting to the same world. But does perspective matter? Yeah. Read up on linguistics, on just how different the perspectives provided by languages are. Just how much people's view of themselves, their culture, their relationship to others, nature, their relationship to nature, time, just how all these things are related to language. But again, in providing links, you aren't providing anything of substance to any of these issues.
We constantly find that. More often than not, the natural world transcends cultural barriers because...
How do we find through scientific observation that the natural world transcends anything? The natural world is what it is. You haven't defined the term transcendence. You didn't when this video started.
Objective truths are universal.
Objective truths are universal. What does that mean? What are the objective truths? You haven't named a single one. Are these axiomatic truths? I mean, I can buy that. I understand. I argue for the concept of axiomatic truths, but the thing is that axiomatic truths aren't things. In order for any argument to be an objective truth, it has to not be a thing. Things are objectively true, but so what?
Question is, why would people want to make you question what you can prove, only to replace it with what cannot be proven?
Well, what do you understand about the concept of proof? Is this logical proof? Is this philosophical proof? Is this empirical proof? But you're back to this whole mischaracterizing by relativism, just using it as a label to make something appear to be weak, even if it's not. What truths are you talking about? Something you objectively know versus something else? Every objective truth of understanding that's been overturned by science was defended using the argument that you're using. Why replace what you know with what you don't know?
There's only one true answer to that question. Knowledge is power.
So start reading some fucking books.
Books great, this great. Reading Rambo, reading Rambo, reading Rambo.
From right-wing religious evangelism to left-wing social constructivism, there are those who seek to control the masses through the suppression of truth.
Honestly, that's what you're doing. You need a lot more education on the methodology of argumentation. To begin with, you're all over the fucking place in this video. There's no significance to any of the details that you brought up. You need to define a premise, a single thesis, and outline supporting points and then defend those points. That is a logically sound construction. There's no structure or form to this. Your thought process doesn't actually lead anywhere. You just begin with an assertion, based on terms that you haven't defined, and then meander all over the fucking place.
Always remember that 2 plus 2 equals 4.
Well, unless you're doing mathematical proofs that involve calculus. Very large values of 2, very low values of 2 will ultimately yield different outcomes. No, I'm sorry, but you just seem to be unaware of mathematical proofs. How 2 plus 2 can equal 5. Are you counting inclusively? Are you calculating sigmas? Is 0 a reasonable part of your data set? Because if it is, a value of 2 represents 3 points on a data plot, and 2 sets of 2 represent 6. Or 5 if you're counting ordinally one way and cardinally another. But more to the point, in proofs involving calculus, you have to know if you are converging on a function, if you're converging upwards or downwards. In other words, numbers can be irrational and motion is irrational. And if you can't wrap your mind around that concept, then you can't really use calculus. You aren't going to be able to derive or integrate. You're not going to understand how numbers are the results of functions. This is not useful, cutting-edge mathematical observation. This is trite.
This is RockingMrE, over and out.
This is Friendo, and dude, go fuck yourself.
It's all there, black and white, clear as crystal. You get nothing. You lose. Good day, sir.